It starts with the quiet, before the screens, before the discovery, before a small Iowa town became a permanent part of American crime history. It starts with a simple, ordinary Sunday, June 9th, 1912. The Moore family went to the Children's Day program at their local Presbyterian church. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were a well-known, respected family in Villisca, Iowa. After the program, 2 neighborhood girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were invited to stay the night. It was a common friendly gesture in a town where people didn't lock their doors. The next morning, the quiet was wrong. A neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed the Moore house was still. No sounds of children playing, no sign of morning chores. The shades were all drawn, which was unusual. She tried calling, she knocked on the door, no answer. The silence from that house felt heavy, unnatural. She called Josiah Moore's brother Ross. Ross Moore arrived. He had a key. He tried the front door, but it was locked from the inside. He knocked and shouted. Still nothing. He went around to the back, to the screen door. Also locked. He pulled out his keys and found one that fit the front door. He unlocked it and stepped inside. The first room he entered was the downstairs parlor. The windows were covered. He saw 2 shapes on the bed. He thought they were Sarah's visiting relative. He called out. No response. He went upstairs. What he found there is the stuff of nightmares. In the master bedroom were Josiah and Sarah Moore. In the children's room were the 4 Moore children. They were all dead, bludgeoned in their beds as they slept. Ross ran from the house, stumbling into the yard, telling Mary Peckham to call the sheriff. Someone, he said, had been murdered. When law enforcement finally entered and assessed the scene, the full horror became clear. The 2 shapes in the downstairs parlor were not relatives. They were Lena and Ina Stillinger, the young overnight guests. 8 people in total, from a 43-year-old man to a 5-year-old boy, had been killed with an axe. The murder weapon, Josiah Moore's own axe, was found in the guest room downstairs. It was bloody and had been wiped clean, but not perfectly. The killer had been methodical. He had started upstairs with Josiah and Sarah, moved to the children's room, and then gone downstairs to kill the Stillinger girls. The town doctor estimated they had all been killed sometime shortly after midnight. But the brutality of the act wasn't the only thing that chilled investigators. It was these strange, deliberate things the killer did afterward. He had taken the time to go through the house and perform a series of bizarre rituals. He found pieces of clothing, skirts, aprons, dish towels, and used them to cover the faces of every single victim. He had also gone around the house and covered all the mirrors and any surface of reflective glass with cloths. A pane of glass in the front door was covered. A wash basin filled with bloody water sat on the kitchen table, suggesting he had tried to wash his hands. A 4-pound slab of raw bacon was leaning against the wall near the axe. A small keychain was found on the floor. The house was locked from the inside when the bodies were found. The investigation was a mess from the start. Hundreds of curious townspeople trampled through the crime scene, touching things, contaminating evidence. Souvenir hunters took pieces of the house. The early days of forensic science were no match for the chaos. The town's trust dissolved into paranoia. Suspects were named. Accusations flew, but nothing stuck. The case grew cold. The murder of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls was never solved. Over a century later, the questions remain. Who did it? And why? But one question haunts people more than any other. It's the detail that feels the most personal, the most unnerving. Why did the killer cover their faces? This single act separates the Villisca murders from a simple, violent home invasion. It suggests something more complex was happening in the killer's mind. It wasn't just about killing them. It was about what came after. This one detail, the cloths over the faces, has become the central clue in a 100-year-old puzzle. It's a window, however small and murky, into the psychology of a person who could wipe out an entire family and 2 young guests in the dead of night. There are several theories, each one paints a different picture of the killer. The first, and perhaps the most common, theory is that the killer felt shame or remorse. This idea suggests the killer knew the victims. He wasn't a stranger, he was someone from their lives, maybe even someone they trusted. After the horrific violence, standing there in the dark, silent house, surrounded by the results of his rage, he couldn't bear to look at them. He couldn't face the people he had just destroyed. Covering a victim's face is a powerful act of depersonalization. It turns a person into an object. It creates a barrier between the perpetrator and the victim. For a killer who knew Josiah or Sarah, who had maybe seen their children playing in the yard, this act could have been a desperate attempt to psychologically distance himself from what he had just done. he was trying to erase them, to make them anonymous. It's the action of a person in conflict. One part of him was filled with a rage so profound he could kill 8 people with an axe. Another part of him, the part that covered their faces, was perhaps horrified by the carnage. This theory gained some ground when you consider the local suspects. One of the most prominent was a man named Frank F. Jones. He was a powerful state senator and a business rival of Josiah Moore. Moore had worked for Jones for years at his farm implement store before leaving to start his own, directly competing business. Moore had taken the dealership for John Deere with him, a huge blow to Jones. Rumors also swirled about an affair between Josiah Moore and Jones's daughter-in-law. There was bad blood, real animosity. The theory goes that Jones didn't commit the murders himself. He was too prominent, too old, but he might have hired someone to do it. A man named William Blackie. Mansfield was a suspected hitman, and some investigators believed he was hired by Jones. But would a hired killer, a professional, feel the need to cover his victims' faces? It seems unlikely. A professional killing is a job. It's impersonal by nature. The act of covering the faces feels deeply personal. It speaks of a messy emotional motive, not a clean business transaction. So, if Jones was involved and the killer felt remorse, it would have to be someone closer to the situation, someone with a personal stake. Or perhaps the killer wasn't a professional at all, but just a man driven by a personal vendetta. The shame theory points to a killer with a conscience, however twisted and broken it might be. But there is another, darker possibility. What if it wasn't about shame at all? What if it was part of a ritual? This theory suggests the killer was not an angry business rival, but a deeply disturbed individual, possibly a serial killer, acting out a script that existed only in his head. The covered faces were not an act of regret, but a necessary step in his ceremony of violence. This is where the other strange details at the crime scene become so important. The covered mirrors, the slab of bacon, the axe left behind. None of these things are typical of a standard murder. They are what investigators today would call a signature. A killer's signature is not the same as his modus operandi MO. The MO is what a killer does to successfully commit the crime, how he gets in, how he kills, how he gets away. A signature is something he does that is not necessary for the crime itself, but fulfills some psychological need. It's a ritual. Ted Bundy would often return to the sites where he left his victim. The Zodiac Killer sent taunting letters to the press. These were their signatures. For the Villisca killer, the signature was the staging of the scene. Covering the mirrors is a common element in many folk traditions and superstitions surrounding death. Some beliefs hold that a mirror can trap the soul of the recently deceased. Others say that if you see your own reflection in a room where someone has just died, you will be the next to go. Was the killer superstitious? Was he trying to prevent the spirits of his victims from being trapped? Or was he trying to protect himself? And what about the slab of bacon? It was taken from the icebox, wrapped in what was likely a dish towel, and left leaning against a wall in the downstairs guest room. It's so random, so bizarre, that it defies easy explanation. Some have speculated it was meant as a prop for a sexual act, or as some kind of crude offering. And others think he might have intended to start a fire by placing it near the kerosene lamp at the foot of the bed, hoping to burn the house down and destroy the evidence, but was either interrupted or changed his mind. When you see the covered faces not as an isolated act, but as one part of a larger, weirder picture, the ritual theory makes more sense. The killer wasn't feeling remorse. He was fulfilling a fantasy. The victims were just props in his private theater of death. Covering their faces was part of the script. It was a way to dehumanize them, to make them fit the role he needed them to play in his twisted drama. This theory is bolstered by a particularly chilling suspect, Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was a traveling minister who had been in Villisca for the Children's Day services on the night of the murders. He was an odd man, known for his strange, intense sermons, and what was later described as a history of mental illness and sexual deviancy. He reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown in his youth and had a history of window peeping. He left town on an early morning train just hours after the murders were thought to have occurred. And years later, investigators began to focus on Kelly. He seemed to know things about the crime that only the killer could know. He eventually confessed to the murders, giving a detailed and disturbing account. He claimed that a voice from God told him to slay utterly. His confession was a mess of religious fervor and bizarre logic. He later recanted, and due to his clear mental instability and the fact that his confession was likely coerced, he was tried twice and acquitted both times. But if Kelly was the killer, the covered faces make a terrifying kind of sense. In his mind, the act might have been a form of piety. Perhaps he was, sparing his victims the indignity of being seen after death, a twisted act of religious respect from the same man who had just crushed their skulls. Or, given his history as a peeper, covering their faces could have been a way to handle the overwhelming intimacy of the crime. He was used to looking from a distance. Up close, the reality of his victims might have been too much, not out of remorse, but out of a psychological inability to confront them as people. The ritual was his way of managing his own insanity. There is a third theory that connects the ritualistic elements to a potential sexual motive. Profilers of violent crimes often note that killers who cover their victims' faces do so to dehumanize them, making it psychologically easier to commit sexual acts upon the body. It's a way of turning a person into a thing, an object for their gratification. This is a deeply disturbing possibility, but there is some evidence at the scene that points to it. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old guest, was found in a peculiar state. Her nightgown had been pushed up to her waist, and she was wearing no undergarments. There was a blood stain on the bed between her legs and a small cloth, possibly used to wipe something nearby. The position of her body was different from the others. While everyone else seemed to have been killed in their sleep, it's possible Lena was awake. She had a defensive wound on her arm. The killer had spent more time with her. He had struck her in the face with the blunt side of the axe, not the blade, and had returned to her room after killing everyone else to strike her again. This focus on Lena suggests a specific, and possibly sexual, interest. If this was the killer's primary motive, then covering her face and the faces of the others fits a known psychological pattern. He didn't want his victims looking at him. He didn't want to see a human face while he committed his acts. It was the ultimate act of objectification. The other rituals, the covered mirrors and the bacon, could have been part of this disturbed sexual fantasy. They are elements that don't make sense to us, but they made sense to him. They were part of what he needed to do. This theory leads to another potential suspect, or at least a pattern of similar crimes. A man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Villisca Moore family, was a serial killer active in the region around the same time. Just a few months after the Villisca murders, he used an axe to kill his own mother and grandmother in Columbia, Missouri. His methods were eerily similar. The victims were killed in their beds at night with an axe. The killer then covered the lamps with cloths. After his arrest, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Investigators at the time, and researchers since, have tried to connect Henry Lee Moore to Villisca. Could he have been a transient killer, passing through town and acting on his dark impulses? The timeline fits. The weapon of choice fits. The general MO fits. Some reports even suggest that in other crimes he was suspected of, he also covered his victims' faces. If Henry Lee Moore was the Villisca killer, then the murders were not about a local business dispute or a specific religious mania. They were the work of a serial predator. In this context, covering the faces was part of his signature, something he did across multiple crimes. It was what he did. For serial killers, the ritual is everything. It's how they refine their craft and satisfy their needs. The reasons might be a blend of all the theories: shame, ritual, sexual, fantasy, all wrapped up in one deeply broken mind. He covered the faces because that's what the monster inside him demanded. So what is the most likely reason? We will never know for sure. The trail is too cold, the evidence is too compromised. All we have are the chilling facts of the crime scene and the unsettling possibilities they present. If the killer was a local, someone who knew the Moors, then the shame and remorse theory feels compelling. It's a human reaction, however warped, to an inhuman act. The thought of a neighbor, a friend, or a family acquaintance being capable of such a thing is, in some ways, the most terrifying scenario. It means the monster wasn't a stranger passing through. It was one of their own. If the killer was a religious fanatic like Reverend Kelly, then the ritual theory, steeped in a twisted sense of piety and madness, seems to fit. The covered faces were an act of a mind completely detached from reality, following a divine and bloody command. This speaks to the terror of the unknown that can hide behind a mask of normality, even in a man of the cloth. If the killer had a sexual motive, possibly focusing on young Lena Stillinger, then the face covering was a tool of dehumanization. This paints the killer as a predator, the most dangerous kind of monster, one who seeks not just to kill, but to violate and degrade. And if the killer was a traveling serial murderer like Henry Lee Moore, then the covered faces were simply part of his pattern. Villisca was just one stop on his journey of death. This is terrifying in a different way. It suggests a randomness to the violence, the idea that any family in any quiet town could be a target. It means the monster could come from anywhere at any time. Each theory is plausible. Each theory has its holes. The shame theory doesn't easily explain the other bizarre rituals like the bacon. The ritual theory depends heavily on the guilt of a man who was never convicted. The sexual motive theory, while fitting a known criminal profile, is based on a limited amount of physical evidence. The serial killer theory is compelling but circumstantial. Ultimately, the act of covering the victims' faces is what makes the Villisca axe murders endure in our collective memory. It's a detail so strange, so intimate, that it forces us to try and understand the mind behind the act. It's a quiet, haunting gesture in the middle of a scene of pure chaos. The violence of the axe is brutal and easy to understand on a primal level. It's rage, it's destruction, but covering the faces is something else. It's psychological. It's thoughtful. It was a choice made in the silence after the killing was done. The killer took the time. He walked from room to room in the dark with only the light of a small kerosene lamp. He found cloths. He gently, or perhaps roughly, laid them over the faces of the man, the woman, the 4 children, and the 2 young girls he had just murdered. He did this for a reason. And it is that reason, that piece of the puzzle we can never truly know, that keeps the story of Villisca so alive and so terrifying. The cloths were meant to hide the faces of the dead, but what they really do is reveal the profound and enduring mystery of the person who put them there. They are a monument to an unknown motive, a silent testament to a killer's strange and terrible ritual. The axe fell, the blood flowed, but the final, deliberate act was one of concealment. He was hiding them from his sight, or from the world, or from their own souls. And in doing so, he hid himself from us forever.